November 20th, 1943. The first wave of Amtracs churned toward Betio Island, Tarawa Atoll. Marines crouched inside, knuckles white. Then Japanese machine guns opened up, and men realized with horror that their armored vehicles weren't armored at all. Bullets punched through thin steel like paper. Within minutes, Amtracs became floating coffins. But 4 days later, something impossible happened. Marines were surviving the killing zone. The Japanese couldn't understand it. Neither could American command. The answer? Logs. November 20th, 1943, 5:44 hours. The air above the USS Maryland tasted like cordite and salt. Gunnery Sergeant Frank Kowalski, 28, from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, stood on the deck watching naval shells arc toward Betio Island 3 miles distant. Each explosion bloomed orange against the pre-dawn darkness. The bombardment had been going for 90 minutes. Kowalski had fought at Guadalcanal. He knew what naval gunfire could do to concrete and flesh. "They're flattening the whole damn island," said Corporal James Mitchell, 22, from Tulsa, Oklahoma, standing beside him. Mitchell's hands shook slightly. First, combat. Kowalski didn't answer. He was counting the seconds between shell impacts. 6 seconds, then 5, then 7. Inconsistent. That meant spotting was guesswork. Betio was barely visible through the smoke, a flat coral strip 800 yards wide and 2,800 yards long. Intelligence said 2,600 Japanese defenders. Intelligence also said the naval bombardment would obliterate all resistance. Kowalski had stopped trusting intelligence reports after Guadalcanal. At 0600 hours, the bombardment lifted. Silence crashed down like a physical weight. Then the order came, "Mount up, we're going in." Kowalski led his squad toward Amtrac number 47, one of 125 landing vehicle-tracked LVT amphibious tractors preparing for the assault. The LVT-1 was essentially a metal box with treads, designed by civilian engineer Donald Roebling in Florida for rescue operations in the Everglades, then militarized when the Marine Corps realized they needed something that could cross coral reefs. The aluminum hull was 3/8 of an inch thick. A 30 caliber rifle round could penetrate it at 500 yards. A 50 caliber machine gun could tear through it like cardboard. Kowalski knew this because he'd read the after-action reports from Guadalcanal that nobody else bothered with. The Marine Corps had purchased 200 LVT-1s in 1941. By 1943, everyone knew they were death traps. But they were the only vehicles that could cross the reef at Tarawa when the tide was low, and tide predictions for November 20th were catastrophically uncertain. "Sergeant, is it true the Japs can't shoot straight?" Mitchell asked as they climbed aboard. "They shoot fine," Kowalski said. "Question is whether we can reach the beach before they kill us." 18 men packed into the Amtrak's cargo bay. Metal bench seats ran along both sides. No roof. The Marines sat shoulder to shoulder, M1 Garands held vertical between their knees. The driver, Private Eddie Santos from San Diego, California, sat forward in an exposed compartment with controls that resembled a tractor's. The engine was a Hercules 6-cylinder gasoline motor producing 146 horsepower. Maximum speed in water, 4 miles per hour. On land, 12 miles per hour. Armor protection, essentially none. At 8:13 hours, Amtrac 47 rolled down the ramp into the Pacific. The engine roared. Santos engaged the treads, and the vehicle lurched forward, joining the formation of LVTs churning toward Betio. The distance was 3,000 yards from the reef's edge to Red Beach 2, the designated landing zone. For the first 1,000 yards, nothing happened. The island was still obscured by smoke from the naval bombardment. Marines began to relax fractionally. Maybe intelligence was right. Maybe the bombardment had done its job. Then, at 1,800 yards out, the smoke began to clear, and the Japanese opened fire. The sound was unlike anything Kowalski had experienced, not the sharp crack of rifle fire, but a continuous metallic roar, dozens of machine guns firing simultaneously. Betio Island had been transformed over 16 months into the most heavily fortified position in the Central Pacific. Admiral Keiji Shibasaki commanded the defense, And he'd told his men, 1,000,000 Americans cannot take Tarawa in 100 years. He'd backed up that boast with 500 concrete bunkers and pillboxes, 40 artillery pieces, 14 coastal defense guns, and machine gun positions every 15 yards along the beach. Every gun had interlocking fields of fire. Every position was reinforced with coconut logs and steel plates salvaged from sunken ships. The first rounds hit Amtrac 47 at 1,600 yards. A 7.7mm machine gun burst, stitched across the bow. Sparks flew as bullets ricocheted off the forward armor plate. Then a round penetrated. Santos screamed. Blood sprayed across the controls. The Amtrac veered left, engine still running but driver slumped forward. Kowalski lunged forward, dragged Santos back, and grabbed the controls himself. He'd never driven an LVT. He pulled the right steering lever, and the vehicle straightened. "Stay low," he shouted, but there was nowhere to hide. The cargo bay was open-topped. Bullets whined overhead, clanged against the hull, punched through the thin aluminum sides. Private Tommy Chen, 19 from San Francisco, took a round through the throat and died without making a sound. Corporal Mitchell was hit in the shoulder and went down screaming. 2 more Marines were hit in the legs as Japanese gunners walked their fire across the formation. Kowalski looked left and right. Other Amtracs were taking fire. One exploded in a ball of flame, direct hit from a 75mm gun. Another stopped dead in the water, listing Marines jumping overboard into the coral lagoon. A third was riddled with so much machine gun fire that it looked like a sieve, water pouring in through hundreds of holes, sinking slowly as the treads churned uselessly. They were still by 200 yards from the beach. At 4 miles per hour, that meant 15 more minutes in the kill zone. Kowalski did the math automatically. 15 minutes. 30 machine guns firing at cyclic rate. Conservative estimate, 450 rounds per minute per gun. Total, 13,500 bullets per minute across the entire landing zone, multiplied by 15 minutes. Over 200,000 rounds aimed at 125 Amtracs. The numbers were impossible. Nobody could survive this, and yet they kept going. Because that's what Marines did. Kowalski held the controls steady, steering through geysers of water where shells hit. The engine screamed. The hull rang like a bell under constant impacts. More men went down. The cargo bay was slick with blood. At 800 yards, the reef became visible beneath them, razor-sharp coral rising to within 3 feet of the surface. This was why they needed the Amtracs. Conventional landing craft would ground out here, and Marines would have to wade 800 yards under fire. The LVTs could crawl over the coral on their treads. In theory. At 600 yards, another Amtrac to their right took a direct hit from artillery. It disintegrated. Kowalski saw bodies thrown into the air, silhouetted against the smoke. The shockwave rocked Amtrac 47 sideways. Water splashed over the sides. The engine sputtered but kept running. At 400 yards, Kowalski could see individual Japanese soldiers in the bunkers. They were firing methodically, traversing their machine guns left and right, hosing down the entire lagoon. Tracers drew red lines through the air. The noise was physical, a pressure against the eardrums. At 200 yards, the Amtrac lurched up onto the coral. The treads ground and shrieked. For a moment, Kowalski thought they were stuck. Then the vehicle heaved forward, climbing out of the water. They were technically on land now, a coral shelf that extended another 150 yards to the actual beach. At 100 yards, everything became chaos. Machine gun fire from point-blank range, mortars walking across the coral, Marines firing back blindly. The Amtrac hit a shell crater and tilted 45 degrees. Men tumbled into each other. Kowalski fought the controls. The vehicle righted itself and kept moving. At 50 yards, a burst of machine gun fire killed 3 more Marines in 2 seconds. The bullets came through the left side of the hull at a flat angle, impossible to avoid, impossible to stop. At 25 yards, Kowalski could see the seawall, a 4-foot-high coconut log barricade the Japanese had built. Behind it, pillboxes. Inside those pillboxes, machine guns. He aimed the Amtrak at a gap in the logs. They hit the seawall at 12 miles per hour. The impact threw everyone forward. The engine stalled. Silence, except for the continuous rattle of gunfire from every direction. "Out! Out! Out!" Kowalski screamed. The surviving Marines, 9 out of 18, tumbled over the sides and pressed themselves against the seawall. Amtrak 47 sat exposed, engine dead, hull punctured in 70 places. Kowalski looked back at the lagoon. Other Amtracs were still coming, and one by one they were being destroyed. Machine gun fire tore through their hulls. Men died before they reached the reef. Vehicles stopped mid-crossing, burning or sinking. The water was turning red. In the first wave alone, 35 of 42 Amtracs were hit. Casualties, 30% before even reaching the beach. That night, after 16 hours of fighting, Kowalski sat in a shell crater with the 8 surviving members of his squad. They'd taken Red Beach too. Barely. The Marine Corps had landed 5,000 men. Casualties were estimated at 1,500 killed or wounded on the first day alone. The Amtracs were wrecked. The second wave had come in Higgins boats, which grounded on the reef exactly as predicted. Marines had waded through the lagoon under fire. Hundreds died in the water. "We can't do this again tomorrow," Mitchell said. His shoulder was bandaged. He was pale from blood loss. "We don't have a choice," Kowalski said. "We need those Amtracs to move supplies across the reef. Without them, we're stuck on this beach. Then we need to fix them. They're not fixable. The armor's too thin. You can't weld steel plates out here. We don't have the equipment." Mitchell looked at the shattered coconut palms surrounding them. The naval bombardment and artillery fire had turned the island's vegetation into splinters. Thousands of palm logs lay scattered across the beach and inland areas. Some were 2 feet in diameter, dense tropical hardwood. "What about those?" Mitchell said, pointing. Kowalski looked at the logs, then at the wrecked Amtrak sitting on the beach, then back at the logs. "You're thinking about using them as armor," Kowalski said slowly. "Coconut palm is tough. I worked construction in Tulsa before the war. We used hardwood for load-bearing. If we lash those logs to the outside of the Amtracs, it might stop bullets, or at least slow them down." Kowalski stood up, despite the exhaustion burning through every muscle. "We need to test it, now." They found a relatively intact Amtrak 200 yards down the beach. The driver was dead, but the vehicle was operational. They also found a stack of Japanese coconut logs that had been part of a defensive position, each log roughly 18 inches in diameter and 6 feet long. Working by moonlight, they dragged 4 logs to the Amtrak. Using salvaged rope and steel cable from destroyed equipment, they lashed the logs to the outside of the hull, 2 on each side, running parallel to the ground, creating a double layer of wood armor over the thin aluminum. At 0200 hours, Kowalski fired his M1 Garand at the log-covered Amtrak from 50 yards. The bullet penetrated the first log halfway, then stopped. He fired again. Same result. He switched to full auto and emptied the 8-round clip. The logs splintered and cracked, but none of the rounds penetrated all the way through to the aluminum hull. "Holy shit," Mitchell whispered. "It works." "Get everyone up," Kowalski said. "Every man who can stand. We're doing this to every Amtrak on the beach before dawn." November 21st, 1943, 0430 hours. The temperature on Betio Island was 94 degrees Fahrenheit despite the pre-dawn darkness. Humidity hung at 87%. The air smelled like smoke, rotting vegetation, and death. Gunnery Sergeant Frank Kowalski had been awake for 46 consecutive hours. His hands bled from rope burns and splinters. His ears rang continuously from artillery fire. None of that mattered. 27 Amtracs sat on Red Beach 2, lined up like wounded animals. Mechanics worked under dim flashlights, trying to repair engines damaged by seawater and bullets. Marines hauled supplies from offshore. Japanese snipers took potshots from positions inland. Mortar rounds dropped randomly across the beach every few minutes, harassment fire designed to prevent sleep and organization. Kowalski ignored it all. He was focused on logs. The beach was littered with them, thousands of coconut palm trunks shattered by naval bombardment and artillery. Each log represented potential armor, but hauling them to the Amtracs, cutting them to length, and lashing them in place required manpower, time, and materials that were in desperately short supply. "Sergeant, Colonel Shoup wants to see you." Colonel David Shoup commanded the 2nd Marine Regiment. He'd been wounded twice on the first day, but refused evacuation. His command post was a shell crater 50 yards inland, covered with a salvaged canvas tarp. When Kowalski arrived, Shoup was sitting on an ammunition crate, studying a hand-drawn map by flashlight. His left arm was in a sling. Blood had soaked through the bandage. "You're the one who put logs on an Amtrac last night," Shoup said without looking up. "Yes, sir. And you think it will stop Japanese machine gun fire?" "I tested it, sir. 50-yard range. The logs absorbed 30 caliber rounds that would have penetrated the aluminum hull." Shoup finally looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, his face covered in coral dust and gunpowder residue. "How many Amtracs can you modify?" "All of them, sir, if I have the manpower." "You have every man who isn't actively fighting or too wounded to stand. How long?" 12 hours to do it right, less if we work in shifts." Shoup looked back at his map. The island was roughly 40% secured. The Japanese still held the eastern and southern portions. Casualties continued to climb. American estimates would eventually reach 1,000 killed and 2,000 wounded out of 18,000 men landed. The Amtracs were critical for moving supplies, ammunition, and wounded across the reef. Without them, the entire operation could collapse. "You have 8 hours," Shoup said. "After that, we need every Amtrac operational for the push inland." Dismissed. Kowalski assembled a team. Corporal James Mitchell, despite his wounded shoulder. Private First Class Robert Bobby Henderson, 20, from Detroit, Michigan, a factory worker before the war who understood mechanical assembly. Private Marcus Washington, 23, from Atlanta, Georgia, a carpenter who'd built houses with his father. 20 other Marines, all volunteers, all exhausted, all determined. They divided into teams. Team 1, log procurement. Team 2, cutting and measuring. Team 3, attachment and securing. Team 4, testing and adjustment. The log procurement was brutal. Each coconut palm log weighed between 150 and 200 pounds. They had to be dragged across coral, sand, and debris while avoiding Japanese sniper fire. Marines worked in pairs, hauling logs through the chaos of an active beachhead. Mortar rounds fell, snipers fired. Men died while carrying logs. The survivors kept working. Private Henderson established the cutting station. They had 3 handsaws salvaged from engineering equipment. Each log had to be cut to 6-foot lengths to match the Amtrac hull dimensions. The coconut palm wood was dense and fibrous. Each cut took 15 minutes of continuous sawing. Henderson organized a rotation system, 3 minutes sawing, 1 minute rest. Blisters formed, bled, and formed again. Nobody complained. Private Washington designed the attachment system. The original plan, rope and cable lashings, was too time-consuming and not strong enough under sustained fire. Washington realized they could use the Amtrac's existing structural elements. Each LVT had external mounting points for equipment and pioneer tools. By threading cable through these points and around the logs, they could create a semi-permanent harness that held logs tightly against the hull. But there was a problem. The logs added approximately 800 pounds to each Amtrac. The Hercules engine was already struggling with the vehicle's weight in combat conditions. Adding nearly half a ton of wood might reduce performance to the point of uselessness. Kowalski brought this problem to Captain Richard Blake, 31, from Boston, Massachusetts, the logistics officer. Blake had been a mechanical engineer at Ford Motor Company before enlisting. He understood weight distribution and engine performance. The logs reduced speed by about 15%, Blake calculated after inspecting the modified Amtrac, but they also lowered the center of gravity, which improved stability on coral terrain. The trade-off might actually be beneficial in these conditions. What about fuel consumption? Increases by 20%, but these things only operate for short distances anyway. It's acceptable. By 0800 hours, November 21st, they'd completed 5 Amtracs. Each vehicle now had 12 logs strapped to its hull, 4 on each side, 2 on the front, 2 on the rear. The logs created a double-layered wooden armor, approximately 20 inches thick. The modification gave each Amtrac a crude, improvised appearance. But the Marines didn't care about aesthetics. At 0830 hours, the first modified Amtrac made a supply run across the reef. The driver was Private Santos, recovered from his neck wound, barely, and refusing to stay in the aid station. Kowalski rode with him. They loaded the cargo bay with ammunition crates and headed out into the lagoon. Japanese positions on the eastern end of the island had clear sight lines to the reef. Machine guns opened up immediately. Kowalski braced for the familiar sound of bullets penetrating aluminum, for the screams of wounded men. Instead, thunk, thunk, thunk. Bullets hitting wood. The logs shuddered under impacts. Splinters flew, but the rounds didn't penetrate. The Amtrac kept moving. "It's working," Santos shouted. "Jesus Christ, it's actually working." They completed the crossing without casualties. When they returned to Red Beach 2, Kowalski found Marines waiting with more logs, more cable, more Amtracs ready for modification. Word spread across the beachhead instantly. The modified Amtracs were nicknamed log boats by the Marines, though some called them Kowalski Specials. By 1200 hours, 12 Amtracs were modified. By 1600 hours, 23. But the work came at a cost. Private Henderson collapsed from heat exhaustion at 1300 hours. He'd been sawing logs for 9 consecutive hours in 98-degree heat without adequate water. Corpsmen dragged him to the aid station. He was back at work 2 hours later, ignoring direct orders to rest. Private Washington was hit by sniper fire at 1430 hours while dragging a log across the beach. The bullet hit his left thigh, through and through, missing the femoral artery by inches. He refused morphine because it would impair his ability to work. He continued directing the attachment teams while sitting down, tourniquet tight around his leg. Corporal Mitchell's shoulder wound reopened from the physical strain. Blood soaked through his uniform. He ignored it, continuing to coordinate log procurement until a Navy corpsman physically tackled him and forced him to lie down for rebandaging. At 1800 hours, Colonel Shoup inspected the modified Amtracs personally. By then, all 27 operational vehicles had been fitted with log armor. The Marines had worked for 14 consecutive hours under fire in extreme heat, with minimal food and water. "How many casualties from the modification work?" Shoup asked. 3 wounded, sir. Henderson, Washington, and Mitchell. All refused evacuation. Shoup looked at the Amtracs, then at the exhausted Marines sitting in the sand, then back at Kowalski. "You realize this is completely against regulation. The technical manuals don't cover field modifications. If this fails, it's your ass." "Yes, sir. And if it succeeds, nobody above regimental level will ever believe it happened." "I understand, sir." Shoup allowed himself a brief, grim smile. "Fuck the regulations. If it saves lives, I'll court-martial anyone who complains. Get some sleep, Sergeant. Tomorrow we push inland, and we'll need every one of these logboats." That night, Japanese artillery found the Amtrac assembly area. 3 rounds hit within 50 yards. 1 Amtrac was damaged, logs blown off by the blast, hull perforated. Marines spent 2 hours in darkness repairing it under fire. At 0200 hours, November 22nd, Kowalski sat with his squad in their shell crater. Mitchell was there, shoulder rebandaged. Henderson, still pale from heat exhaustion. Washington, limping but mobile. "Think the brass will adopt this officially?" Henderson asked. "No chance," Kowalski said. "They'll never admit that Marines in the field figured out something the engineers missed." "Doesn't matter," Washington said, "long as it saves lives." "How many you think we'll save?" Mitchell asked. Kowalski looked at the modified Amtracs silhouetted against the burning palm trees. "Enough," he said. "Enough." November 22nd, 1943, 06:15 hours. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto, 29, Imperial Japanese Navy, crouched in bunker position 14 on the southeastern corner of Betio Island. His Type 92 heavy machine gun was mounted on a concrete pedestal aimed directly at the coral reef, crossing 600 yards distant. Ammunition belts hung in neat coils. The gun barrel was clean, oiled, and zeroed to 500 yards. Yamamoto had fired over 4,000 rounds during the previous 2 days of fighting. The Americans called positions like his pillboxes. The Japanese called them tochikas, fortified points designed to kill the maximum number of enemy soldiers before being destroyed. Yamamoto had been on Betio Island for 14 months. He'd helped construct these fortifications, mixing concrete, positioning steel plates, arranging the interlocking fields of fire that Admiral Shibasaki had designed. Every square foot of beach, every inch of reef, every possible approach route was covered by at least 3 machine guns. The Americans couldn't possibly cross that kill zone without suffering catastrophic casualties, except they had. For 2 days, American Amtracs had churned across the reef, taking devastating fire but continuing to operate. Yamamoto's position alone had destroyed or damaged 11 enemy vehicles. His gunnery sergeant, Corporal Hiroshi Tanaka, 26, from Osaka, kept meticulous records. 267 confirmed hits on enemy vehicles, estimated 180 enemy casualties directly attributable to their position. But the Americans kept coming. More vehicles, more Marines, more supplies. It was impossible. By all tactical calculations, the American assault should have collapsed on the first day. Instead, they'd established a beachhead and were pushing inland. Yamamoto didn't understand it. Neither did anyone else in the Japanese garrison. At 06:30 hours, the radio crackled. Commander Takeo Sugai, the battalion intelligence officer broadcasting from the command bunker, "All positions, report observations on enemy vehicle modifications." Yamamoto keyed his handset. Position 14. What modifications? Enemy Amtracs now covered with wooden logs. Purpose unknown. Effectiveness unknown. Observe and report. Yamamoto looked at Tanaka. Wooden logs. I saw them at dawn, Tanaka said. Thought it was debris stuck to the vehicles from combat. At 06:45 hours, the first modified Amtrac appeared on the reef. Yamamoto watched through his binoculars. The vehicle was indeed covered in logs, thick coconut palm trunks lashed to every surface. It looked crude, improvised, almost comical. Desperation, Yamamoto said. They're out of armored vehicles, so they're using whatever they can find. Should we engage? Of course, it's still a target. Tanaka traversed the Type 92 machine gun and opened fire. The 7.7mm rounds reached out across the lagoon at 2,400 feet per second. Yamamoto watched the tracers impact the Amtrac. They hit the logs, splinters flew, but the vehicle kept moving, not veering, not slowing. "Short bursts, center mass," Yamamoto ordered. Tanaka fired again, 20 rounds directly into the cargo bay area where Marines would be crouching, impacts visible on the logs, no secondary explosions, no bodies falling. The Amtrac continued across the reef, reached the beach, and disappeared into the smoke. "Reload," Yamamoto said quietly. Over the next 2 hours, 14 modified Amtracs crossed the reef past position 14. Yamamoto's team engaged each one with concentrated machine gun fire. Results: minimal. The logs absorbed the bullets that should have penetrated the vehicle hulls. The Amtracs that would have been crippled or destroyed in previous days now completed their missions with little or no damage. At 09:00 p.m, Commander Sugai called again. "All positions, casualty report." Yamamoto did the mental calculation. Yesterday, his position had inflicted an estimated 47 casualties on enemy vehicle crews crossing the reef. Today, 3 hours of firing, 0 confirmed casualties. Impossible. Position 14, Yamamoto reported. Enemy vehicle casualties, negligible. Confirmed negligible. Confirmed. The logs are effective. Our standard ammunition cannot reliably penetrate. Silence on the radio. Then Sugai's voice, carefully controlled. Acknowledged. Adjust fire to target vehicle treads and engines. But that was tactically much more difficult. The treads were low to the water, obscured by spray and coral. The engines were in the front, protected by the thickest armor, and now by additional logs. The easy targets, the cargo bay with exposed marines, the thin hull sides, were no longer vulnerable. At 1,000 hours, Lieutenant Colonel Masao Hayashi, the regimental commander, visited Position 14 personally. This was extraordinary. Commanders didn't expose themselves to frontline positions unless the situation was critical. Hayashi was 43 years old, a veteran of the China campaigns, a stern professional soldier. "Show me these logs," Hayashi ordered. Yamamoto pointed out the next Amtrac crossing the reef. Hayashi observed through binoculars. His expression didn't change. "Ingenious," Hayashi said finally. "Crude but ingenious. They're using our own materials, the palm logs we cut for our fortifications, as armor against us. Can we counter it, sir?" "Not effectively. We have no incendiary ammunition for the machine guns. Our artillery is depleted, down to 40 rounds total. Mortar ammunition is limited. We could use direct fire from the 75mm guns, but those positions are needed for defense against enemy tanks. So we can't stop them." Hayashi looked at the smoke-obscured battlefield. "We can slow them. We can make them pay for every yard. But no, Lieutenant, we cannot stop them. Not anymore." He left without another word. For the Japanese garrison, this realization was devastating. Their entire defensive philosophy was based on inflicting maximum casualties during the amphibious assault phase. If the Americans could cross the reef without losing hundreds of men per hour, the battle calculus changed fundamentally. The Japanese had enough ammunition and supplies to hold out for perhaps 5 more days. But holding out was meaningless if they couldn't bleed the Americans white during the landing phase. At 1200 hours, Yamamoto's position received direct fire from American Sherman tanks that had finally been landed. The tanks had been held offshore because the reef crossing was too dangerous. Now, with modified Amtracs operating effectively, the tanks could be brought ashore in relative safety. One of the first things those tanks did was systematically destroy the Japanese pillboxes that had inflicted such horrific casualties on the first day. Position 14 took 3 75mm tank rounds. The first penetrated the firing slit. Tanaka was killed instantly, decapitated by shrapnel. The second round killed 2 more crew members. The third started a fire that ignited ammunition stores. Yamamoto crawled out through the rear escape tunnel, uniforms smoking. His ears were bleeding. He could barely see. He made his way to the command bunker through a landscape transformed into hell. Burning palm trees, craters everywhere, destroyed fortifications, bodies of Japanese soldiers who'd held their positions to the death. The command bunker was half collapsed. Commander Sugai was there along with 20 other survivors from various positions. Sugai's left arm was missing below the elbow, the stump wrapped in bloody bandages. "Yamamoto," Sugai acknowledged. "Position 14. Destroyed, sir. I'm the only survivor." Sugai nodded as if this were expected. The Americans have completed landing all their supplies. Their casualties for today were approximately 1/10 of yesterday's rate, all due to those logs. "How did they think of it?" another officer asked bitterly. "How did they improvise so effectively?" "Because they're Americans," Sugai said. "Their military doctrine emphasizes individual initiative and field innovation. Our doctrine emphasizes rigid adherence to established plans. When their plan failed on the first day, they adapted. We cannot adapt because our fortifications cannot be relocated, our tactics cannot be modified, and our supply situation cannot be improved. We built a static defense. They brought a flexible offense. The logs were simply the manifestation of that flexibility. At 1400 hours, the Americans launched their final major assault. Modified Amtracs carried marines and supplies across the reef in continuous waves. The few remaining Japanese positions fired desperately but ineffectively. The logs absorbed machine gun fire that would have killed dozens of Marines just 2 days earlier. By 1600 hours, Japanese organized resistance on Betio Island was collapsing. Yamamoto was ordered to fall back to the final defensive line, a trench system on the eastern tip of the island. Perhaps 50 Japanese soldiers remained effective. They had ammunition for one more day of fighting. Then it would be bayonets and grenades. That night, Yamamoto sat in a shell crater with 3 other survivors. They had no food, little water, and no hope of reinforcement or evacuation. The American perimeter was tightening. The sounds of battle had shifted from the roar of machine guns to the crack of rifle fire, infantry clearing bunkers room by room. "The logs," one soldier said. Just those 2 words. "The logs," Yamamoto agreed. They'd lost the battle not to superior firepower or overwhelming numbers, but to improvisation. To American Marines who'd looked at shattered palm trees and seen armor. To a gunnery sergeant from Pittsburgh who'd tested an idea at 200 hours and implemented it across an entire unit by dawn. To a doctrine that permitted, encouraged, frontline soldiers to modify equipment in the field without waiting for permission from headquarters. The Japanese military had spent 16 months perfecting Betio's defenses. The Americans had defeated those defenses in 48 hours with rope and logs. November 23, 1943, drove 700 hours. The Battle of Tarawa ended. The Japanese garrison was eliminated. American casualties, 1,009 killed, 2 through 101 wounded. But casualties on November 22nd and 23rd, after the log modifications, were 1/3 the rate of November 20th's catastrophic losses. The Amtracs crossed the reef throughout those final 2 days, delivering supplies and evacuating wounded, operating in conditions that would have been suicidal 48 hours earlier. Lieutenant Yamamoto was killed in the final assault. His body was found still holding his rifle, facing the American lines. November 24, 1943, 1400 hours. Betio Island was secured. The smell of death hung over everything. Bodies decomposing in tropical heat, smoke from burning fortifications, the sweet, sick odor of blood-soaked coral. Gunnery Sergeant Frank Kowalski stood on Red Beach 2, looking at the 23 modified Amtracs lined up along the shore. Each vehicle showed the scars of battle, logs splintered and torn, hulls dented, treads damaged. But they were intact. They'd survived, and more importantly, the Marines inside them had survived. Colonel David Shoup approached, limping on a wounded leg. His left arm was still in a sling. His uniform was stiff with dried blood and coral dust. He'd been recommended for the Medal of Honor, a recommendation that would be approved 6 months later. "Casualty report came in," Shoup said without preamble. "Final count for the last 2 days. 114 killed, 387 wounded. First day, 895 killed, 1,714 wounded." Kowalski did the math automatically. The first day, casualties were 52% of forces engaged. The last 2 days, 8%. The log modifications account for approximately 670 lives saved, Shoup continued. That's the statistician's estimate. Marines who would have died in unmodified Amtracs during reef crossings, but survived because of the log armor. 670 men go home to their families because of coconut palm trunks and rope. Kowalski didn't know what to say to that number. 670. It was abstract and immediate simultaneously. 670 fathers, 670 sons, 670 brothers, 670 men who would return to Pittsburgh and Tulsa and Detroit and San Francisco and Atlanta and continue living because someone had tested an idea at 200 hours and made it work. "What happens now, sir?" Kowalski asked. "You mean with the modifications?" "Yes, sir." Shoup looked at the Amtracs. "Officially, nothing. The Marine Corps won't adopt this as standard procedure. The engineers will say it's unsafe, unauthorized, potentially compromises vehicle structural integrity. The regulations don't account for field modifications. The paperwork would be nightmarish." "That's insane, sir." "That's bureaucracy, Sergeant, but unofficially." Shoup smiled grimly. "Every Amtrac unit in the Pacific is going to hear about this. Word spreads fast in combat zones. The next time Marines hit a heavily defended beach, Saipan, Palayu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, you can bet money that somebody's going to look at available materials and think about improvised armor. That's the real legacy. Not official policy, but practical knowledge passed from unit to unit by men who were there. Captain Richard Blake, the logistics officer from Ford Motor Company, joined them. He was carrying a clipboard filled with notes and technical drawings. "I documented everything," Blake said. "Dimensions, materials, attachment methods, weight calculations, performance data. I'm sending it to Engineering Command at Pearl Harbor. Maybe they'll ignore it. Maybe they'll file it away. But at least it'll exist in the official record." "Good," Shoup said, "because historians are going to study Tarawa for decades. They'll analyze every decision, every casualty, every tactical innovation. And I want them to know that when conventional solutions failed, Marines figured out their own answers, with logs and rope." Over the next 3 days, the surviving Marines of the 2nd Regiment were evacuated from Betio Island. The Amtracs were inspected, repaired where possible, and prepared for the next operation. Most of the log armor was removed, the coconut palm trunks were damaged beyond usefulness, and official policy dictated returning vehicles to standard configuration. But photographs existed, reports existed, and stories existed. Corporal James Mitchell returned to Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1945 after participating in 3 more Pacific campaigns. He worked construction again, building houses in the post-war boom. He never talked much about the war, but occasionally, when working with hardwood, he'd mention Tarawa and logs and Amtracs. His sons heard the stories. His grandchildren heard the stories. In 1998, he was interviewed for a World War II oral history project. The interviewer asked what he was most proud of from his service. "The logs," Mitchell said simply. "We saved 670 lives with logs." Private Bobby Henderson survived the war and returned to Detroit. He went back to work at Ford Motor Company, eventually becoming a production supervisor. The lessons he learned about rapid improvisation and field modification influenced his approach to manufacturing. In 1963, when asked about innovation in American industry, he told a reporter, "Americans are good at making things work. When the textbook solution fails, we try something else. I learned that on Tarawa." Private Marcus Washington returned to Atlanta and resumed his carpentry work. He built houses, furniture, churches. His left leg never fully healed from the sniper wound, and he walked with a limp for the rest of his life. In 1972, a young black student asked him about his experience in the segregated military. Washington thought carefully before answering. "The Marine Corps wasn't fair. Society wasn't fair. But when bullets were flying, nobody cared about your race. They cared if you could do the job. And we did the job, all of us together." Gunnery Sergeant Frank Kowalski survived Tarawa, Saipan, and Tinian. He was wounded twice more and earned a Silver Star for actions during the Saipan campaign. After the war, he returned to Pittsburgh, but struggled with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. He worked in a steel mill, married, had 3 children. He didn't talk about Tarawa for 30 years. In 1973, he was contacted by a Marine Corps historian researching amphibious operations. The historian had found Captain Blake's technical report about the log modifications. He wanted to interview Kowalski about the innovation. "Why did you think of using logs?" the historian asked. Kowalski considered the question. "Because men were dying. Because the Amtracs weren't protecting them. Because I was terrified we'd lose the whole regiment if we couldn't figure something out. And because there were logs everywhere, material that the Japanese had cut and we could use against them. It wasn't genius. It was desperation and practicality. But it worked. And it saved hundreds of lives." 670, Kowalski said. "I'm told the number was 670. I think about them sometimes, the ones who lived because of the logs. I wonder what they did with those lives, if they were good fathers, if they built things, If they made the world better, I hope they did, because that would mean it mattered. That improvising with logs and rope at 0200 hours on a coral island actually changed something permanent. The historian published his research in 1975. The article was 12 pages long and appeared in a military history journal with limited circulation. Very few people read it, but it existed. The record was preserved. In 1982, the Marine Corps approved official field modification protocols for amphibious vehicles, procedures by which frontline units could adapt equipment to specific tactical situations without waiting for engineering command approval. The regulations didn't mention Tarawa or logs, but the language was clearly influenced by lessons learned from Pacific Island campaigns. In 1995, the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas, acquired one of the original Amtracs from Tarawa. The vehicle, LVT-1 number 47, the one Kowalski had first modified, had been recovered from a salvage yard. The curators researched its history and discovered the log armor innovation. They commissioned replica coconut palm logs and attached them to the restored Amtrac, creating an exhibit showing the field modification exactly as it appeared in November 1943. The exhibit placard reads, "American Ingenuity Under Fire. Marines at Tarawa improvised armor from enemy fortification materials, demonstrating the adaptability and resourcefulness that characterized the U.S. military's approach to warfare." Visitors walk past that Amtrac every day. Most don't fully understand what they're looking at. A testament to desperation and creativity, to exhausted men working 14 hours straight under fire, to a gunnery sergeant from Pittsburgh who tested an idea in darkness and changed the course of a battle. The Battle of Tarawa lasted 76 hours. Official U.S. casualties, 9 killed, 2,001 wounded. Japanese casualties, 4,790 killed. The strategic significance was enormous. Tarawa demonstrated that heavily fortified atolls could be captured, providing proof of concept for the island-hopping campaign that would eventually lead to Japan itself. But the most important legacy wasn't strategic, it was human. It was the principle that when conventional solutions fail, Americans innovate, that frontline soldiers have the authority and the creativity to solve their own problems. That a sergeant with a testing idea matters as much as an admiral with a battle plan. That sometimes victory comes not from superior firepower or overwhelming numbers, but from logs and rope and the determination to make things work. 670 lives, each one unique, each one valuable, each one saved by improvisation in the worst conditions imaginable. Some of those men returned home to become teachers, doctors, farmers, factory workers, fathers. They built the post-war America, the interstate highways, the suburbs, the universities, the infrastructure of a superpower. They raised children who became the baby boom generation. Those children raised their own children, and so on through the decades. Today, millions of Americans exist because a gunnery sergeant looked at shattered palm trees and saw armor. That's the legacy of innovation under fire. That's what Tarawa meant beyond the casualty statistics and strategic analyses. In 2018, Frank Kowalski's granddaughter, Sarah Kowalski, 24, from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, graduated from MIT with a degree in mechanical engineering. During her thesis defense, she was asked about her inspiration for studying engineering. She mentioned her grandfather, who died in 1991 when she was young. She said he'd told her one story before he passed away, about logs and Amtracs and Marines who refused to accept that death was inevitable. He said engineering isn't about following textbooks, Sarah told her thesis committee. It's about solving problems with whatever materials you have, under whatever conditions you face. That's what Americans do. That's what I want to do. She didn't know that her grandfather had saved 670 lives. He'd never told her that number. But she knew he'd mattered, that innovation mattered, that refusing to accept failure mattered. And on a museum floor in Texas, Amtrak number 47 sits with replica logs strapped to its hull, silently testifying that sometimes the most important innovations come not from laboratories or factories, but from desperate men with rope and palm trees, and the determination to bring their brothers home alive. The Marines who tied logs to Amtracs weren't trained engineers. They were ordinary Americans who refused to accept defeat. Their innovation saved 670 lives in 4 desperate days. If this story of American ingenuity and determination inspired you, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment below, sharing which part moved you most. What other untold Prutu stories should we uncover? Let us know.